Here we go. Welcome to lecture 8 of 9, the second to last lecture. Last week we looked at relational aesthetics. I know that Steve Fossey has told me that you were looking at relational aesthetics in Frameworks 2, or if you haven't, you will be on Tuesday. Today we're also going to look at the kind of relational paradigm, but we're going to look at criticisms of relational aesthetics and a term that Claire Bishop came up with called relational antagonism. So it's still about relational art, but it's critical. So we'll start with a recap about relational aesthetics so that we can get our minds back into what that's all about before we can criticize it. Nicolas Bourriaud wrote a book called Relational Aesthetics, and he defined relational aesthetics as a set of artistic practices which take as their theoretical and practical point of departure the whole of human relations and their social context. Notice that this is a study skills point. With my in-text citation, you have to put the author's surname, the year, and the page number, if there's a page number for your quotation. So if it's in a book, on page 14, you've got to put 14 now. And notice that I didn't do that. I didn't put Bourriaud. And that's because you do not have to if you've already mentioned the author's name in the sentence. So for example, Bourriaud defined as, quote, you don't need to put Bourriaud in the in-text citation there. It's obvious who has said it. Relational practices moved away from traditional objects making to working with the public. In some cases, at least, the public or human relations was the medium. So not a picture of people eating dinner together, but a dinner put on for people to come together and eat together. Now, relational art is primarily about aesthetic relations that are open-ended rather than what it sees as a concrete social form. Do you remember? We talked about this or my group did at least, in the seminar. Relational art cannot change the world, says Bourriaud. And in this, it differs from avant-garde art, which believed it could change the world. So this lecture, number 8, relates to essay question number 8, which is, was Bishop right to call for relational antagonism? So you should make a note of that question and think about it throughout the lecture and see if you can come to some sort of conclusion on that. Obviously, there's not a right or a wrong answer. You can agree with Claire Bishop or not, but she gives reasons for why relational aesthetics is weak, and you need something called relational antagonism, which obviously I will explain what that is. There's only one more essay question after this, next week's lecture, and the essay question is something like, which I might have it open on screen on another tab. How did 9/11 affect art activism? So I'm just telling you that because we're coming to essay planning now. And if you think, oh, I'm really interested in art activism and art after 9/11, I really, even though we've not done that yet, I want to make a start thinking about that, and then I'll see what happens in the lecture next week. You could do that. If you didn't like the content of last week's lecture, relational aesthetics, it kind of annoyed you in some way, you think there's something a bit weak about this, then maybe you might be really interested in answering this essay question, which is a critique of relational aesthetics. Okay, so I'm going to give a cultural context, and remember Do you remember when we went through the assessment criteria for the presentation in the rehearsal, we talked about some things that you might not have planned in, such as the context, the social, cultural context in the presentation. But the same is true for the essay. You have to put it in a broader context. You have to understand how this, whatever essay question you're answering, what was going on in the world at the time, how art related to the world at the time. And we can characterize relational art as existing in a time in the world when we moved from a goods-based economy to a service-based economy. What do I mean by that? Well, in art terms, artists under a goods-based economy made objects. Sculptures and paintings are objects, aren't they? You can pick up a painting. You can sell it if you want to. You can swap it if you want to. You can put it on your wall and use it as decoration. Artists made handmade objects, sometimes as a counterpoint to mass-produced or factory-produced objects. But artists also sometimes used the techniques of mass production. We can think of Andy Warhol, for example. I'm assuming you all know who he is. If you don't, write his name down now and look him up after the lecture. Andy Warhol created a kind of art studio in a building in New York, which he called the Factory. And he churned out artwork as if it were mass produced. So he didn't paint things by hand, he screen printed them. Before he was an artist, he was a graphic designer. So he took the commercial techniques from graphic design and put that into art. Yeah. Some people see these points above as problematic because they say, well, artists are producing commodities for the market, and maybe the market art you make. If you know that a certain type of painting sells really well and is collected really well and gets good reviews in magazines, there's a pressure to make that kind of art and not the kind of art that doesn't sell and no one wants and no one writes reviews about or says is rubbish. And also a select few people, rich patrons, get to influence what kind of art's made. So we, you know, before well, in my time, I suppose, my generation was very influenced by the 1990s. Charles Saatchi became a very powerful and rich collector of people's work like Damien Hirst, Tracey Emin, and so on, all of the so-called YBAs, young British artists. And some people would say, well, he's just some guy with lots of money, but he has influenced who the most famous artists are by spending £1 million on Damien Hirst's sculpture Him, for example, or giving Damien Hirst all of the money in order to make that shark in formaldehyde. Damien Hirst couldn't have done that on his own. He needed a rich patron. And Charles Saatchi didn't give money to somebody else to make a different type of art. So some people say, well, that's problematic. Under a service-based economy, artists offer services. Memory itself could become the product of the experience. Contemporary artists began to design or troubleshoot amenities within a museum. We're going to have examples of these throughout the lecture. But some people saw this as problematic. A kind of laboratory where artists create experiences also becomes marketable, not as a product that you can pick up and sell, but as a space for leisure or entertainment. So maybe art under relational aesthetics becomes like entertainment, which is also a commodity, isn't it? You can't pick it up necessarily, but you can buy a ticket to go and do something. And at the same time, in the wider economy, obviously, Britain, for a number of years since the 1970s, stopped producing objects and moved to being a service-based economy, which means we start, rather than selling cars and coal and steel, we started selling insurance and derivatives and financial services and other things like that. So it's linked, the art is linked. There's another shift. There used to be art galleries and museums, there still are, but increasingly, since the 1990s, we have seen the rise of the project space, the biennial, and the art fair, which are different to galleries and museums. Yeah, the shift in object making to working with the public coincides with the proliferation of new institutions, art fairs and so on, that display and consume relational art. That's according to Dean Kenning. I can see someone's trying to join the lecture and it's just covered over my slides. I can't see what's on screen now. Let's try again. Okay, good. So what does that mean? We had project spaces such as the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. You definitely can't get into the lecture. The Palais de Tokyo opened in 2002, which coincidentally is the same year that relational aesthetics was translated into English for the first time. And it was opened by, guess who? Jérôme Son, who you don't know, and Nicolas Bourriaud. So he's a curator and he opened this art space in Paris to display, quote, ideological exhibitions. The hangs, we talk about a hang as if it's paintings, but I mean installation of artwork, sought to reinforce or epitomize the ideas contained within the work. The style of curating was a direct reaction to types of art produced in the 90s. The idea was that it was open-ended, interactive, with no sense of closure, in that the work appeared to be in progress rather than completed. So it embraces process rather than a finished object. You don't make the artwork in your studio anymore, finish it and put it in the museum or gallery. No, you come into the gallery to make the artwork with the public. The process is the artwork. So project spaces. So the Palais de Tokyo is a big institution in Paris, but it doesn't have a permanent collection. There aren't artworks that exist in there. So it's an empty space, and then a show comes on, an artist comes in and does something, and then packs up everything and leaves. And then another artist comes in and does something. While that might have existed before the 90s, it became much more common after the 90s. This means that as an audience, as critics, rather than interpreting a piece of artwork, looking at an object and saying, what does this mean? The artwork in front of us is in flux. So it's open to constant reassessment. In other words, on Monday, I look at it and say, I think it's all about this. But on Friday, you could look at it and say, it's changed now. Adaptability and versatility are key words. It wasn't just in the Palais de Tokyo. This happened in Britain, the Baltic in Gateshead, or it's in Gateshead technically, but it's basically Newcastle, opened. It doesn't have a permanent collection. It's a big art gallery. Also, we have places like Turner Contemporary in Margate. Again, no permanent collection, an empty art museum, if you like, that you go to see specific exhibitions. An exhibition hall, I suppose you could think of it. think of it as an exhibition hall. There are exhibitions on at these places with objects, but there are also sometimes exhibitions of work in progress, in flux, relational work. But what if, in those cases, says some people like Claire Bishop, what if the work is just unfinished? What does transforming the exhibition space into a kind of social space where you can work with publics in participatory ways, or even if not, I can come in to the exhibition space and interpret it in a different way every day. What does that actually achieve? Is there not a danger that these become spaces for leisure and entertainment? And is there not a danger that the artist isn't really making the artwork, but putting forward a proposition and asking other people to work out whether it's art or not? Is that a problem? Is that a bad thing? This also happens in art biennials. If you don't know what an art biennial is, look up the Venice Biennale. But Biennale is Italian for biennial. And you might hear me use the word Biennale a lot, even in English, because the Venice Biennale was the first contemporary art biennial in the world a long time ago. It's been running for a long, long time. Biennial means every 2 years. So every 2 years, there's a big festival with exhibitions in galleries and on the streets and so on in Venice. It's really good. Then there's the Documenta, which is not a biennial technically, because it's not every 2 years. It is every 5 years, but similar thing. And historically, the Sao Paulo Biennale has been around for a long time. Somebody muted me then. Yeah, the Whitney Biennale in New York is important. And in Manifesta, we have a roving biennial. It's not in the same city. It changes every year in Europe. But there have been loads more now. There are loads of biennials that have spread all over the world. So contemporary arts has moved from, as you can see there, mainly Europe and America, with Brazil as well. But it's moved to India, it's moved to China, it's moved to the Arab states, where there's a lot of money to collect art, literally all over the world. Also, regionally. So in Kent, where I'm from, we have the Whitstable Biennale, which is, a decent art biennial. We also have the Folkestone Triennial every 3 years, and that's very high quality. So these things are very common. It's a way of making and showing art. And they're not to be confused with an art fair. An art fair is a commercial venture, which can be really good. Famous ones include Frieze in London and the Armory Show in New York. There are others. And there what happens is lots of galleries from all over the world come in to a city for a week or 2 weeks or so to trade art, really. But it's open to the public and you can go and see tons and tons of art. I recommend that you do that. In London, in Frieze, it is in October, COVID permitting. You should go. Some people hate Frieze. I hate Frieze. It's very, very crowded. You get to see some celebrities walking around, looking at art as well, if you like that sort of thing. Most people seem to be viewing art through their phones or cameras, not actually looking at it. But there are really good events on, and you can see an awful lot of contemporary art from all over the world. And if you don't even go, you have to pay. It's quite expensive, but it's good value for money because you get to see loads of art. And learn what galleries show what art, exhibit which artists. If you don't like that, there's loads and loads of events on all over London. So all the galleries put on decent shows and stuff during Frieze Week. Okay. Yeah, the other criticism here is it can be difficult to work out what a work's about when its identity is willfully unstable. It's designed to be so that you can't say what the work's about, almost, Bishop thinks, especially if its meaning can change. The artist has no idea what the meaning's going to even be because they're working with participants, and the participants are going to feed into this over time. So on Monday, the artist thinks it might be about X, and by Friday, it's about something else. So this lecture is designed to teach you about three main strands of critique of relational art. These come from Claire Bishop in October Journal, Artforum, Art Magazine, and later in her book, Artificial Hells. So she wrote a few articles actually critiquing relational art and then kind of expanded upon them in her book, Artificial Hells, in 2012. Also, Grant Kester, who she has a massive argument with in Artforum, is also a critic of relational arts. He critiques relational arts in Artforum and in his book, The One and the Many. And like Bishop, he takes some of the things he's already published in Artforum and expands upon them in his book in 2011. And also Hal Foster in the London Review of Books criticises relational arts, as we will see. These critics all ask similar things, like, if human relations are the artwork, then where are the objects that spark these relations? Is it in the pile of candy by Felix González Torres that we saw last week, for example? If so, how do we evaluate such objects? How do we judge a pile of candy? Do we only judge it by the level of participation, or should we assess the object aesthetically too? So they've noticed that in most cases there is something physical, even though it's about human relations. And how important is that? How do we evaluate relational art when it supposes that forming relations is a good thing? What if it's not? What if you want to be on your own? Or what if those relations are complicated or bad in some way? Not all relations are good, they point out. Exploitation is a human relation. Humiliation, physical or psychological abuse are also relations, according to Jason Miller. Therefore, relational art is not necessarily good. So therefore, how do we evaluate relational art ethically? And how does this relate to the aesthetic quality of the artwork? Burio doesn't say. He makes assumptions that making relations is good. Bishop, here she is. She's very concerned with how we judge the quality of human relations in art. She's concerned that process is given too much emphasis over product. Even if the relations are good, she says, how do we judge relational art as art, not as a good relation? So let's say there's an artwork called Conflict Kitchen in America, which brings together refugees from Afghanistan and war veterans from Afghanistan to eat together. Let's say we all agree that that's a good thing. The relationship's good. It's a nice thing to do. People that used to be maybe on opposite sides in a war zone are now friends. But is it good as art? And if so, what makes it good as art? I have a quotation from Bishop. She says, Burio wants to equate aesthetic judgments with ethico-political judgments of the relationships of a work of art. What does that mean? That means for Burio, if an artwork produces ethically good social relations, it is therefore a good artwork aesthetically. But how do we measure or compare these relationships? The quality of the relationships in relational aesthetics is never examined or called into question. When Bourriaud argues that encounters are more important than the individuals who compose them, I sense, this is Bishop talking, I sense that this question is, for him, unnecessary. All relations that permit dialogue are automatically assumed to be democratic, as in everyone can speak, and therefore good. But what does democracy really mean in this context? If relational arts produces human relations, the next logical question is to ask, what types of relations are being produced, for whom, and why? This is, in other words, to ask, are the relational artworks successful politically and or aesthetically as art? Regarding her second point, process over product, she says consensual collaboration is valued over artistic mastery and individualism, regardless of what the project sets out to do, what it wants to do, or what it actually achieves. So long as the process is egalitarian, democratic, non-hierarchical, then the artwork is judged to be successful, regardless of its output. Here, Bishop is raising questions about how it should be judged as art. And the nub of her critique is the connection between ethics, judging a work on its processes, hierarchies, relationships, and so on. Not the content, we're not talking about the ethics of, I don't know, a picture of Hitler or something and saying, well, that's a picture of a bad man, we don't like that. No, we're talking about how the artwork is made. So if I say I want to make a relational artwork with you guys, if I tell you what to do, that's deemed as being hierarchical. But if I listen to you and we work together, that's deemed as being egalitarian. You're equal to me in the process. And therefore that is deemed by Bourriaud to be good. So that's, for her, it's all about the ethics and the aesthetics. Aesthetics, by that we mean judging the artwork on what it is or what it does. Traditionally, aesthetics is associated with beauty, assessment of beauty, but it doesn't have to be just beauty. It can be, well, what is beauty? You could say it like an intellectual beauty, or you know, something really clever is aesthetic. So what does Bishop like? That's what she doesn't like. Well, she favours artwork that acknowledges or confronts the tensions between the two. But she's saying it's not just good to make something pretty, and it's not good just to make something that is ethical. Like if I organise a coffee morning for refugees, that's ethical. It's a good thing to do, but it's maybe not art. And if I paint a pretty picture of a puppy dog, maybe it is pretty, but it doesn't do anything socially. But she says it's good when artworks have both elements, aesthetic and ethical. And she bases her judgment on this on a philosopher called Jacques Rancière, who you will hear about more over the course. So she wants to emphasize art's autonomy in order to expose and deconstruct social and political power structures. What does that mean? Art's autonomy, as in it has to actually be art. It's not good enough for her that it is just a good social relationship. That's what she means by art's autonomy. It needs to be autonomous from ethics. There needs to be something that is art. It doesn't have to be an object. It can be participatory for sure, but what makes it art is important to her. And for the type of art that she's talking about, the fact that it is autonomous means that it can expose and deconstruct political and power structures. We might also say it can be provocative or antagonistic because it is art. If it's just an ethical, social event, it won't do that. So for her, part of the key thing about art is that it is critical. And she accuses Bourriaud's examples of being more concerned with scenarios and systems of display than the relations, actually. Bourriaud's scenarios are supposedly considered to be inherently political because they have the capacity to produce positive human relations. But as we've seen, the quality of those relationships is never analysed. Therefore, for Bishop, relational art is flawed because instead of turning to appropriate social practices as points of comparison, the tendency is always to compare artists' projects with other artists on a basis of ethical one-upmanship. The degree to which artists have models of good or bad collaboration. In other words, we don't compare them properly. It's just, oh, you've included more ethnic minorities than this artist, therefore that artwork is better. You've made a more egalitarian structure of decision making. You've empowered people more, therefore it's better. And to criticize those kinds of artworks, so she's saying that what is happening is one-upmanship ethically. That's better because you've included more minority groups, for example. And then people criticize the other one for failing to represent its subjects, as if that is even possible, she says. The emphasis, therefore, is on process over product, or perhaps more accurately, process as a product. Grant Kester has some similarities. For him, Bourriaud's examples are still essentially choreographed. Do you remember we made this distinction in the lecture on happenings? Is it scripted? Do you tell people what to do, or do you allow them some autonomy to invent what the artwork is? And he says relational art is still choreographed and therefore hierarchical. It still divides the artist from the viewer. Kester also feels that Bourriaud's relational art is nothing new and underplays the history of performance, art, and socially engaged collaborative practices. So in a way, he's going, that sentence that I've read out is the opposite to Bishop, because he's saying it needs to be more egalitarian, it needs to be more open-ended, it needs to be more politically correct. And it's not new. Now, Bishop connects relational art to the avant-garde and neo-avant-garde, art and theatre. But Kester says this connection is an elitist and exclusory tactic to assert the hierarchical traditions of art criticism onto a form of art that actually has real potential to create dialogue with artists and non-artists. So even what Bishop's saying, he's saying is hierarchical because you're relying on traditional art histories, for example. Kester criticizes, though, the use of shock tactics in some relational art that we're going to see today. He doesn't like shock, like maybe like we saw with the Viennese actionists. This is supposed to make the viewer aware of their own complicity in an oppressive secular economy, or in the case of the Viennese actionists, saying to the people from Vienna and Austria, you're complicit in the Second World War, remember that. He doesn't like that. He prefers socially engaged art that reduces hierarchies For example, the assumption of the artist as the creator and the audience as the passive spectator. So Kester is arguing much more for open-ended horizontal forms, and he is one of those people who favours the ethical. So he's in opposition to Bishop, but he's also in opposition to Bourriaud. He thinks that Bourriaud doesn't go far enough. And Hal Foster, he just says it's become a bit of an arty party, relational arts. It's more Lennon than Lenin, which he's referring to pop music, John Lennon, the Beatles, rather than Vladimir Lenin, a socialist revolutionary. He's saying it's not revolutionary, it's just you're just playing at stuff. Let's go back to Bishop. She draws heavily on a theorist called Chantal Mouffe, who works with her partner here, Ernesto Laclau. Laclau and Mouffe argues that they're not art theorists, they're political theorists. They argued that a fully functioning democracy is not one where antagonisms disappear, but a full democracy is one in which new political frontiers are constantly being brought into debate. In other words, a democratic society is one in which relations of conflict are allowed and are sustained, not erased. So what Bishop's interpreting here is she's saying that the ethical, do you remember she said we don't judge the relations in relational arts, but she's saying, hey, everyone getting on is actually a bad thing, because if you're not allowed to have an opinion that's different or that's offensive or that upsets some people, then if everyone has to agree, then that's not democracy. Democracy is where you are allowed to have lots of different voices and opinions, different political parties, different options, and so on. Perhaps, I think, the recent rise of populism, Brexit, Donald Trump, etc., is a reaction against being told there is no alternative, which Margaret Thatcher said, and New Labour's third way politics. So we're not going to go into all of that now, but in the 1990s, the political parties moved closer to the centre and became, some people think, very similar. So Blair is not that dissimilar to Cameron, for example. And they did that to be electable because they looked at market research and thought, well, if we move to the left, we lose a lot of voters. And if we, the Conservatives, move to the right, we'll lose voters. We'll try to take the middle ground. But in doing so, they become the same. And if you want something different, who do you vote for? I'll give you a concrete example. In 1997, Labour were elected, and they introduced university tuition fees. Let's suppose you were 18 in 1997. I was actually 18 in 1997. And let's suppose that I am really against tuition fees. I'm about to go to university, after all. Let's suppose I'm so against that I want to vote for another party. I want to dissent. In 1997, there was cross-party agreement on tuition fees. In other words, if I vote Labour, I get tuition fees. If I vote Conservative, I get tuition fees. And if I voted Liberal Democrats and by some miracle they were able to form a government, then they were in favour of tuition fees. They later changed their minds and said that they would get rid of tuition fees and formed a coalition government with the Conservatives, but they trebled tuition fees from 3,000 to 9,000. So if there are many different issues, but you think, well, I can't vote for anyone that's going to represent me. That might be frustrating. You might find that it's not democratic. You don't get your voice heard, and therefore maybe some other parties can come up. Let's look at Brexit as an example. What was the Conservative line on Brexit? Remain. What was the Labour Party line? Remain. What was the Liberal Democrat Party line? Remain. What was the SNP, Scottish National Party line? Remain. What was the Green Party? What did they say? Remain. Plaid Cymru, the Welsh nationalists? Remain. They're all telling you to remain. So maybe it's not surprising that a party like UKIP comes along and says, I think some people want to leave. We will represent you. And they gained quite a lot of votes. At one point, I think 18% of the vote. Not huge, but quite big. Okay. So Bishop's point is everyone getting along and agreeing is not a good thing. Some healthy disagreement is a good thing. And also she thinks, well, look, antagonism is part of life. We have to deal with this and acknowledge it. Relational art simply ignores it. Literally, do you remember the discussions we had about microtopias? And in my seminar group, we were talking about monks, not going out and changing the world, but moving away, as far away as you can get to build a monastery. Ignore the world, build up the walls, shut it. How artists, in a way, were doing the same thing. Let's not change the world, they said. We can't change the world. So let's just form a microtopia, a micro-utopia in a gallery and just have our mates and ignore the rest of the world. Which brings us to relational antagonism. So Bishop prefers artists with a disruptive approach. Remember that contains both the ethical and the aesthetic rubbing up against one another in a dialectical way. She criticises the work of artists like Liam Gillick. He had the discussion platforms and the benches, if you remember last week, and Riakrit Tiravanit. He did the cooking Thai curry for people. She criticises that. And she says it's mixed up with a cosy, glamorous art world where art collapses into entertainment. Conflict and division and instability do not ruin a democratic sphere, but are conditions upon which it is founded. So instead, Bishop proposes the artwork of three artists that we're going to look at as containing this antagonism, relational antagonism. They are Thomas Hirschhorn, Santiago Sierra, and Christoph Schlingensief. All three set up relationships emphasizing dialogue and negotiation in their work, but they do so utilizing unease, sustaining tension as much as feel-goodism that we saw last week. So this lecture is going to look at 4 works by Santiago Sierra, some of which were in the rehearsal last week. Some of you have already found these. It's going to look at 1 work by Thomas Hirschhorn and 1 by Christoph Schlingensief. They're all very controversial artworks because they contain that tension. But first, we're going to look at the way Bishop has categorized a kind of move away from traditional performance art. In chapter 8 of Artificial Hells, her book, Bishop identified the rise of what she called the delegated performance. What does that mean? Well, it means the hiring of non-professionals or specialists in a field to undertake the job of being present at particular times. And she identifies 3 types, actually. But in other words, it's not the artist doing the performance, but the artist getting other people to do the performance, delegating to other people. These are the 3 kinds that we're going to look at. The outsourcing to non-professionals who are asked to perform an aspect of their identity. So if you want to make an artwork about women's rights, you could get a women's rights group and put them in a gallery and say, do your thing, have a discussion, and we will look at it, and therefore you've delegated to them. Or 2, The use of professionals from other spheres of expertise. You might hire an actor, but you might hire a policeman to come in and be a policeman, to do what they do professionally. And lastly, quite different, situations especially constructed for video and film, but still with an element of delegation to somebody. The first type characterizes actions outsourced to non-professionals, people who perform their identity, which is why I said be yourself here. After 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, which we talked about last week, we saw a surge in artistic and curatorial interest in undertaking projects with socially marginalized people, alongside a shift towards the exhibition as a site of production rather than display. A further manifestation of the social turn in contemporary art was emerging through the genre of performance. And one hallmark was the hiring of non-professional performers. Rather than these events being undertaken by the artists themselves, they delegate to other people. This strategy differs from theatre or cinema, where people are employed to act, because here people don't act, they just be themselves, like my example of the women's rights groups. But it could be on other bases. It could be gender, but it could be social class. It could be their ethnicity, age, disability, or some other function. We're going to analyze 4 examples, 3 by Sierra, 1 by Della. So Santiago Sierra delegates to the unemployed and prostitutes and illegal immigrants. He uses those people in his artwork. Della does this with working class people. For example, Santiago Sierra paid people who are unemployed to do nothing but sit inside a cardboard box. Obviously, there's an ethical tension here. Is he exploiting people? Will people do anything for money when they're desperate? Yes, he is. But are some jobs exploiting people? If you have to go and clean a toilet, would you rather sit inside a cardboard box in a gallery than clean a toilet? This artwork asks those sorts of questions, and also asks questions, I think, like, we might feel outraged that he has placed an unemployed person in a box and used them as a material for his artwork. But in the same room is a security guard sitting on a chair, being paid, well, to guard the artwork, but really being paid to do nothing. Is that nourishing, fulfilling labour? Is that exploitative? This brings me to the idea of a waiter. I don't know if you realise, but waiters didn't used to be in restaurants. Waiters used to be servants in houses, like in Downton Abbey. And the reason that they were called waiters is because they were literally paid to stand there and wait until the Lord needed something. I will pay you, my manservant, just to stand there in a room. We can see in Elmgreen Dragset regarding the guards from 2005 a similar kind of debate, because here people are paid to be art gallery security guards, but there's no work. The work is them. They are the work, in the same way that Sierra has delegated to unemployed people. Perhaps these people are unemployed. They've taken a job just to sit there and we look at them. Normally a security guard watches us, says don't get too close to that, but we watch them. That is the artwork. Yeah, Della makes lots of work about social class. He made an artwork called Acid Brass in 1997. He said, I decided to try to get a brass band to agree to perform a repertoire of acid house music. I don't know if you even know what acid house music is, but it's associated with rave culture. Della suggests that there are social and political echoes and points of reference between these two musical movements that sound completely different and come from different eras. And he makes this map to show connections. So acid house music is post-industrial, late 20th century. In other words, after the factories are all closed down, there's lots of unemployment, a lot of youths, young people who are unemployed, can't get work as they would have done in factories, but they are going out to illegal raves in factories or in fields and listening to this music. The brass band movement is not post-industrial, but it starts in the industrial movement. It's all to do with the factory. Factory workers would form brass bands. Some of you might be from Yorkshire, where there's still a tradition of the brass band. Both forms of music are voices that in different ways dissent from the prevailing political and social order. Brass bands are associated with community, solidarity, and the trade union movement. Trade union marches would often have a brass band with them. While acid house is independent from major record companies, and the fact that it was largely illegal fostered a sense of community against the political order of which was seen as being atomized, everyone's individual. They kind of blame Margaret Thatcher for that, but form their own communities nonetheless, illegal ones. Maybe in a way a bit like the microtopias, because they're not trying to change the world, they're just making their own party. This artwork was in one of your rehearsals last week. It's called 160 centimetre line tattooed on 4 people. And what the artist has done here is he has taken, he's done this, by the way, in other forms. So you might see it with a longer line with more people. He's done it more than once. He's done it on men as well. But here he's taken 4 prostitutes and he has paid them to have a line tattooed on their body. Again, is he exploiting drug addicted prostitutes who don't really have a chance to consent properly to this because they're desperate for money? How can people in this state of mind consent? That's the question. Here are some quotations from a message board discussing this artwork. Someone said, "We're all too spoiled in the Western world and are very quick to react to things that we don't necessarily understand. Sierra's work is done to stir thought and emotion and for us to ask our own questions about what we do or don't accept. I would say that having no other option than to become a prostitute to stay alive says much more about exploitation within the Western world than getting a tattoo." If you've all responded, all the people in the comments saying this is terrible, if you've responded, this is at least a message getting out that is making you think about the rights and wrongs of the world. We all know there are a lot of terrible things going on in the world which we choose to ignore. Tattoos and low wages to homeless people don't even register on the radar. Somebody else said, "I think your reaction, a different reaction, is exactly what Santiago Sierra aims for in his work. But your anger is misguided. His work aims to shine a light on this exploitative relationship between rich and poor in capitalist markets. Think about it. There are some people who would be willing to take jobs offering meagre pay and in the worst conditions you can think of. If they try to assert their rights, they're passed over for others because the market is flooded with unemployed, unskilled labourers. No one really cares about this. No one cares that people have to take badly paid jobs with poor conditions. I work in the fashion industry, and it's well known that fast fashion retailers employ people working in sweatshops who are locked in factories so that the masses can afford cheap clothing. So if you hate Santiago Sierra for doing this, what he's actually doing is showing you how easy it is to reduce human beings to a resource. If you don't see the bigger picture, your argument fails. So yeah, he's asking the question, am I evil and exploiting these people for paying them to have a line tattooed on their back? It's horrible, obviously. It's like branding someone. But also, is that not like society that causes them to be in a situation where they have to sell their bodies to survive? Obviously, not every prostitute is drug addicted or desperate, but these ones are, and that's what the artwork's about. Here we have 133 people paid to have their hair dyed blonde. Is that exploitative? Well, Santiago Sierra lives in Mexico, but he's Spanish, and he represented Spain at the Venice Biennale that I mentioned earlier in this lecture. At the opening night of this, I should explain, part of the Venice Biennale has pavilions of each country. So each country, in Britain, we elect someone through the British Council. We elect a representative, someone to represent our country. And we have a pavilion. It's a permanent building that exists in Venice always. And every 2 years we come in and put on an art show there. This is the Spanish pavilion. And on the opening night, he paid illegal street vendors, who are mostly immigrants, about $60 to have their hair dyed blonde. What was he doing here? He is literally highlighting the illegal traders that sell the cheap counterfeit Gucci handbags and other designer goods on blankets on the streets, literally highlighting them as if he's got a highlighter marker and turn their hair yellow. Sierra gave over the space in the pavilion to the workers, though, allowing them to ply their trade. They could sell stuff in his space whilst interacting with bemused gallery goers, so they're less likely to be asked to move on because they're part of an art installation. So those are some examples of the delegated performance where you get people in, not actors, just people to be themselves. In this case, a load of illegal immigrants, let's put you in the gallery space and let you do your thing. In the case of the prostitutes, he doesn't get them to do their thing, but he does the artworks discussing who they are and what they do, and so on. But now we're going to look at a different one. I've called it Be Your Job. So in this case, it's professionals. We're not going to be talking about someone's race or class or gender or anything like that in this. We're going to be talking about what job they do. This type began to be introduced in the later 1990s. It concerns the use of professionals from other spheres of expertise. These performers tend to be specialists in fields other than art or performance, so they don't usually employ artists or performers, since they tend to be recruited on the basis of their professional identity rather than being representatives of any race or class. And because of that, it's much less controversial. we're going to analyse the following examples: the police, philosophy students, and professional sprinters. This is the London version of an itinerant, that means moving around, 3-day exhibition called The Living Currency by a French curator called Pierre Beaublanc. It was first shown in Paris, then it went to Leuven in Belgium, then London, then Warsaw, Berlin. Yeah, I think it ended in Berlin. But at the Tate Modern in 2008, the performances of varying durations took place in the Turbine Hall and on the bridge. This led to sublime juxtapositions such as Santiago Sierra's 8 people facing a wall as the backdrop to Tanya Bruguera's artwork called Tatlin's Whisper, which you can see on the right. This features 2 mounted policemen demonstrating crowd control techniques to the audience. So they're actually doing their professional job in the space. This in turn circled around 6 dancers holding poses. Beaublanc, the curator, his development of this project was rooted in his own experience performing for 2.5 months in Felix Gonzalez Torres's untitled artwork, brackets, Go-Go Dancing Platform. In this work, a scantily clad male, and the male varies, you have different people, puts on headphones and dances on a light bulb studded minimalist podium for 5 minutes a day during the exhibition. Beaublanc felt depressed and subjectified after a month of doing this, and this work raised questions for him that were only answered when he later encountered Santiago Sierra's work. So on the left here, we've got homeless people paid just to face a wall. Is that humiliating homeless people? Maybe. But he talks about how, well, the homeless people talk about how people avoid eye contact with them. People don't look at them, how they may as well be facing a blank wall. And again, we enter into questions about exploitation. How bad is it if he pays them enough money to get a hotel that night for them to stand and face the wall? Is that humiliating? Yes. Is it humiliating to clean drains for a day so that you can afford your rent? Maybe it is. Is it humiliating to work as a prostitute so that you can afford that? Maybe it is. Is work humiliating in general? So that's the first type. And the second type there is policeman, is the policeman. Tino Segal, a German artist who has won the Turner Prize, makes what he calls constructed situations. Do you remember that term? We used it when talking about the Situationist International. I did a lecture on constructing situations and sculpting society. Segal is adamant that his practice not be referred to as performance art. He says, don't call it performance art, call it situations. He says, I don't use performers, don't use that, call them interpreters. His works are scored, like a musical score, he tells people what to do. And the artist actually trained in choreography, dance, and economics before turning to visual arts. In this artwork, 5 performers with their backs turned to you urge you to join a discussion about subjectivity and objectivity. The performers tend to be philosophy students, but their semi-scripted dialogue comes over as somewhat impersonal, as if they've memorized it. Any contribution you make to the debate feels self-conscious and hollow, since it is impossible to alter the work's structure, only to assume your role in it. In other words, you can't change the conversation, you can only talk about subjectivity and objectivity. If you remain silent, if you refuse to discuss that, the performers wilt onto the floor until someone else comes into the space. Here's another example of a paid professional Work number 805 by Martin Creed centers on a simple idea that a professional sprinter will run as fast as they can every 30 seconds through the gallery's Duveen Hall. This is Tate Britain in London. Each run is followed by an equivalent pause, like a musical rest. Creed thinks that the gallery can appear stuffy, even dead. That makes me think of the futurists. They talked about how the museums are like cemeteries. Do you remember that? If death is still, then movement is life, he thinks. And in the art gallery, awakening audiences, alerting them to their surroundings, can be done by someone having doing something unusual in the space, sprinting through it. Here's Pierre Balblanc that I've been talking about, and he makes an interesting point. He says that delegation of performance is echoed in outsourcing. So where we used to have a factory to make watches, we realize it's cheaper if we get a factory in China to make watches for us. That's outsourcing. Offshore outsourcing became a term that refers not altogether positively to the use of hired labour and virtual companies in developing countries, taking advantage of huge differences in wages internationally. Both performance and business now place a premium, he says, on recruitment. And in many cases, the work of finding these performers, whether they are illegal immigrants or policemen or whatever, is also delegated. So the artist doesn't even find them, him or herself. The artist delegates this to the curator. So Pierre Balblanc says the curator now becomes like a human resources manager, negotiating qualifications, shifts, contracts, and so on. Isn't that interesting? The last section is about video and performance in that case, and I've called it perversion and authenticity. So this third strand of performance is composed of situations made especially for video. Bishop's quote here sums it up. The genealogy of this type of performance is complex. On the one hand, it bears a strong relationship to the contemporaneous emergence of reality television. So I'll pause there. This is at the time that Big Brother's coming in, reality TV shows like Towie and Made in Chelsea or whatever it's called don't exist yet, but they are becoming popular. And that itself evolved from the documentary TV and US tabloid TV of the 90s. Like reality television, she says, this type of performance has its roots in a longer tradition of observational documentary, mock documentary, maybe sometimes called a mockumentary, and performance live documentary that came out of the 60s and 70s. Examples might include Gillian Wearing, Artur Zimiewski, Phil Collins, not that Phil Collins, but the artist Phil Collins. This type of performance frequently captures situations that are too difficult or too sensitive to be repeated with real people. It's not documentary. The artist devises the work for film and the participants are asked to perform. However, they can be ambiguous, making audiences unsure of the degree to which it is staged or scripted. That reminds me of a type of reality television that's called scripted reality, which includes Made in Chelsea. That's erroneous. It's not actually scripted. They don't get told what to say, but it is structured. It's not reality television anymore. They construct situations in which people are likely to have certain conversations, do certain things. Supposedly, they're being themselves, but it's done in such a way to make it more interesting. So let's look at an artwork by Phil Collins that Bishop uses as an example. He auditioned and paid 9 teenagers in Ramallah in Palestine to undertake an 8-hour disco dancing marathon in front of a garish pink wall to an unrelentingly cheesy compilation of pop hits. The resulting videos are shown as a 2-channel installation in which the performers are projected to more or less the same size of the viewers, in other words, their life size. And that's supposed to be egalitarian because it creates an equivalence between them and us. We are equals, at least in size. Some critics raise concerns about the artist's exploitation of his performers, though. For example, he did not list their names in the credits. Yet, the point of Collins' project is not to be an exemplary instance of artistic collaboration, but to universalize his participants by addressing multiple genres of artistic and popular experience. In other words, it's not about them as individuals, it's about portraiture. So type of portraits. You don't have to list the person that you paint the picture of, like the Mona Lisa, as a collaborator. It's also about endurance-based body art because they have to keep dancing for a long time. It's about reality television. Perhaps it's about charity television, where people do 24-hour bike rides or run on a treadmill for 24 hours. The title of the work refers to the American author Horace McCoy's novel, They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, from 1935. This novel was adapted into a film in 1969, directed by Sidney Pollack, and it features a dance marathon held during the Great Depression in the United States in the 30s when the book was written. The phrase invokes pity for the contestants who have to endure the competition to earn money, suggesting that they're treated worse than animals. So people are forced to dance for money, and someone says, they shoot horses, don't they? It would be better to be shot. It is also a deliberately perverse approach to site specificity. So there's an elephant in the room here. This is done in Palestine, which is a highly politically charged place, and Ramallah is a highly politically charged place within Palestine even. It's an occupied territory. But the occupied territories of Palestine are never present in this video art. Although there are no standard breaks in the music for the protagonist to rest, some dancers do occasionally sit down, slump on the floor, exhausted. And the performances are also intermittently interrupted by power cuts or a call to prayer. So when you have a power cut more than once, it shows that the infrastructure is not great. Collins plays an ambiguous role. He's both an ally and a taskmaster. He depicts these youths as normal, globalized teenagers. The more usual media representation of Palestinians is to show them as victims, coming out of a bombed out building covered in dust and blood, or as fundamentalist terrorists. This is why Collins uses the usual suspect style backdrop, the line on there. It evokes a kind of police lineup. Okay. We're running out of time because of the announcements I made at the beginning, I guess. So I'm going to have to go faster through the next examples, which are all this same type. Okay, let's go back. Perversion and authenticity. Is it real? Is it not? How much are these people allowed to be themselves? How much is it scripted? Is it reality television or is it structured reality? This is an artwork by a Polish artist called Artur Ziemiewski. It's called Them. He gets different groups together, ladies from the Catholic Church, young socialists, young Jews, and Polish nationalists. And he allows them to be themselves, but they don't get on. So at one point, the Catholic lady, religious lady, someone puts tape over her mouth to kind of shut her up. And someone there has burnt down the image of the church that's been constructed. They alter each other's artworks. It gets nasty. There's very little direction from the artist, but he has set up the situation knowing that conflict is going to come from this. He's less interested in making a faithful documentary than constructing a narrative that is grounded in reality nonetheless. It conveys other points about social conflicts. This is Thomas Hirschhorn's Bataille Monument. So for the documenta that I mentioned earlier, happens every 5 years, he, in a city called Kassel, K-A-S-S-E-L, in Germany, he said for his artwork it wouldn't be there in Kassel, it would be in a working class council estate on the outskirts of this city, and that he would provide taxis to drive people to this council estate to see what's going on there. And there he set up a cafe. He paid people like the minimum wage to work in the cafe. He also set up this kind of monument to Bataille. We all know who Bataille is from the Surrealist lecture, the story of the eye and all of that. And he also set up a library to learn about Bataille. And he said, hey, I'm not being patronizing to these people. Yes, they're working class and maybe they don't know what art is and they're not interested in it, but I think that they can engage with things on an intellectual level. He rented a flat, and as he was setting up, all his equipment was stolen. So he wasn't welcomed into this council estate. But he did form relationships with the people that lived there, and eventually they returned all of his stuff. So maybe maybe it was an ethical thing. Or is it a spectacle? You know, what do you think? Is this a good thing, bossing people out to see how poor people live? It's like a genre of television called poverty porn. We all watch, maybe we don't, I don't really, but lots of people watch programs about people on benefits or something, benefit streets. Something kind of nasty about looking at people that are poorer than you for entertainment. And this brings us to an artwork that I do want to talk about. It's on the front cover of the module handbook. You might have noticed this. If any of you speak German, you will know that Ausländer raus means foreigners out. In the summer of 2000, a German artist called Christoph Schlingensief set up a camp for asylum seekers in a shipping container outside the Vienna Opera House in Austria. So he's German, but he's doing this in Austria, where they also speak German, obviously. 12 applicants for Austrian nationality, immigrants that want to have EU nationality, lived in a shipping container. And inside that, he had a camera which live streamed their activities 24 hours a day over the internet. This is obviously very similar to Big Brother, the first reality TV show to be broadcast fully 24 hours a day. There's a banner on the top that says "Foreigners Out" in German. The container became a flashpoint in Austria's national and racial debates. The documentary of it, which you can buy from the Institute of Contemporary Arts gift shop, covers the event and offers valuable insight into what he was trying to achieve. Schlingensief he's dead now. Was a highly controversial artist. He was arrested at Documenta in 1997, 3 years before this, for wearing a T-shirt that said "Kill Helmut Kohl." He also made posters saying "Kill Helmut Kohl." He was the Chancellor of Germany at the time. But he also won the prize for the best pavilion at the 2011 Venice Biennale. So he's very controversial, he's been arrested, but he wins prizes. So he returns us to the notion of reality TV. He placed real asylum seekers in that shipping container next to the Opera House. These immigrants are then subjected to this kind of Big Brother style TV broadcast. And the Austrian people, like in Big Brother, vote each week to vote someone out. But in reality TV, you vote them off the show. In this case, they're voting them into a deportation centre to be deported out of Austria. The idea is that at the end, there'll be one person left, and that person will be the winner. Supposedly, this person will be granted Austrian citizenship, but Schlingensief doesn't have the power to grant citizenship. So he's going to do it through marriage. He'll get someone to volunteer to marry this person so that they can become a citizen. Now, the aim was to point out, or point at, the artistic use of using parallels between, I'll rephrase, he's trying to point out that this feels very much like a Nazi concentration camp, and it feels like Big Brother. So he says, fascism in the 21st century will be bright, sensational, and interactive. He's saying beware of the nasty side of reality TV, where you pass judgment on people and vote people off. That's not just in Big Brother, it's in The Apprentice, isn't it? You're fired. And everyone at home sits there and goes, yeah, you're rubbish. Get rid of them. So right-wing people and xenophobes came out of the woodwork. They were pleased that someone appeared to share the same voice as them. They thought this was a right-wing artwork. Some left-wing activists eventually attacked the container, destroying the banner that read Ausländer raus, which is reminiscent of the right-wing slogan, Germany for Germans, foreigners out. And they tried to release the participants. Schlingensief replaced the banner with an SS slogan that had been used by the Freedom Party, which is a party in Austria. I remember around this time, Jörg Haider was elected, the first neo-Nazi party to be elected in Europe ever since the war. And their slogan was "Loyalty is our honor." That's what he put up, but it's actually a slogan from the SS in the Second World War. Schlingensief was reacting to this party. He's hoaxing there. I view Schlingensief's interaction as a form of cultural regeneration. It's distinct from building a new gallery. It's not the same as building Nottingham Contemporary, for example, to provide jobs and culture. It argues with people who might decline to engage with galleries. So people that are not interested in art are going to come out and have arguments here. So I've gone over a bit, sorry about that, but we're on 2 slides of summary. The delegated performance today tends to be a luxury game. It is telling that it takes place primarily in the West, and that art fairs and biennials are among the earliest forms to adopt it. Whereas once performance art sought to break with the art market by dematerializing the work into ephemeral events. Do you remember I described that about the New York loft scene? You can't buy performance art, so it's anti-consumerist. Today, though, dematerialization and rumor have become one of the most effective forms of hype. The repeatability of the delegated performance, both as a live event or as a video loop, is central to the economics of performance, and individuals performed and reperformed at many venues. So it becomes entertainment, it becomes reperformable. You can have it maybe on at the same time in two different sites. Now, you could criticize Claire Bishop's examples of relational antagonism for merely repeating the worst forms of capitalist exploitation. Santiago Sierra, after all, doesn't really propose a solution. He doesn't give us an alternative. However, if you do so, you fail to acknowledge that these artists carve out a space where the usual moral norms no longer apply and give an insight. For Bishop, it's more productive to view the conceptualization of these performances as properly artistic decisions where ethics provides the subject matter, but not the work itself. Also, artists choose to use people as material for different reasons, and to judge these works ethically with exploitation at one end and full agency at the other is to miss the point. Instead, we should ask whether it is art fair art or art that exploits in order to raise questions about exploitation. This reminds me of another quotation that I haven't put in here, but Bishop says there's a fight between whether art should be ethical and politically correct, or whether art should be allowed to challenge what is ethical and what is politically correct. After all, what is considered moral is contingent. It changes. What's considered to be immoral in England might not be the same as what's considered to be immoral in Saudi Arabia today, and what's considered to be immoral in England today might be different in 100 years' time or 100 years ago. Who decides what's moral and what's ethical? People are always fighting for new rights. So if we think of gay rights, in the 1950s, being gay was illegal and it was deemed to be immoral. So if you make artwork about that, saying it's okay to be gay in the 1950s, that would be highly controversial, possibly illegal. But today it's considered ethical, moral. So Bishop has to be autonomous from ethical debates in order that it can criticize and push boundaries.